Most authors suggest that the leading tone diminished chord and the dominant are interchangeable. Okay? Let's take a look at why this is. First of all, what is the root relationship between the dominant, the 5 chord, and the leading tone 7 chord? Well, it's a third relationship. So we know we're going to have common tones at work. And as a matter of fact, when we chalk up these chords, let's use C major once again as our example, okay? Here's 7, half diminished 7. Compare that with the dominant 7th chord. Or even the dominant as a triad. You can see that the dominant as a triad has 2 common tones. When we add the 7th factor, now there are 3 common tones. Three common tones. Both chords are 7th chords. Okay, so you can see that the dominant and the leading tone chord have all these notes in common. This is true in minor keys as well. If we go back to A minor, remember the leading tone diminished 7th chord is a fully diminished 7th chord because of the diminished triad and the diminished 7th. Compare that with the dominant. As a 7th chord, the dominant and the leading tone full diminished 7th chord have 3 notes in common. Okay, so you can see that the dominant and the leading tone full diminished 7th chord could perhaps be interchangeable. Now the difference is, when the dominant progresses to tonic, we say that that's a circle progression, a root movement in ascending fourths. When the leading tone chord progresses to the tonic, that's a root movement in seconds. Okay? But because the leading tone chord and the dominant chord are so similar, we consider movement from the leading tone chord to the tonic to be like a circle progression, but not enough like a circle progression to really call it a circle progression. So you're going to see how we use slurs to indicate circle progressions versus dashed lines to indicate leading tone tonic relationships. And that'll be more clear once we have examples to look at. Next, let's compare the leading tone diminished 7th chord to the dominant in terms of its tritone content. We've learned that the dominant has, as a 7th chord, has an inherent tritone. In C major, the dominant 7th chord has a tritone between the 3rd and 7th factor. That's a tritone. Okay, that same tritone is found in the leading tone half diminished 7th chord. And this is true of all major keys. Okay, there's a tritone here. That must seem pretty logical now that you understand the common tone relationship, because this is in common and this is in common. That means that the tritone that is found is carbon copied. What does that mean? Why is the tritone so important? The tritone is important because that's what makes these chords dissonant. And tritones and dissonance require resolution. Okay? So in other words, the dissonance really establishes the need to move forward to the next step, which is resolution. And this propels harmony forward, dissonance and resolution. When it comes to minor keys, the dominant seventh chord is no different than a major key. It has the same tritone found between factors. There's your tritone between the third and the seventh factor. Raising the seventh scale degree produces that tritone. Okay? The leading tone, full diminished seventh chord, differs from major keys because there are actually two tritones. The one that's found in the dominant seventh chord, but also here. Between the third factor and seventh factor, that's also a tritone. Notice that both tritones are diminished fifths when this chord is found in its root position. Okay. So, it's important to know where the tritones are found in these two chords, because in four-part writing, the tritone is going to be considered when we progress this chord to the next chord as the tritone resolves. Okay, just a couple of more lessons here about well, I suppose it would be review about tritones. Consider this tritone. This tritone is a diminished fifth. To resolve this tritone, both voices will move in contrary motion to a third. Could be a major third, could be a minor third, depending on the key, but they move in contrary motion. Okay. When I invert this interval, for instance, if I write D and G sharp, now I have an augmented fourth. Note the difference between the capitalization of the two. Augmented fourths resolve in the opposite direction. Notice that the augmented fourth resolves outward, whereas the tritone of a diminished fifth resolves inward. What's interesting is that these are the same two pitches as these two, we just flipped them around. These pitches are the same as these, but once again we just flipped them around. Okay, so this is how we resolve tritones, and this is going to be important a little bit later when we consider the resolution of these chords in progression, in four-part harmony. Okay. The next video will look at inversions of these chords and how they typically behave in progressions.